Hello, good evening. I'm on time, hooray! Wonders will never cease. It's 5 o'clock and here I am, and hopefully here will some of you be in a moment for another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. We're getting a long way into it now. We're 3/4 of the way through, in fact. So we're really getting towards the end now. I was thinking I put a load of these videos up on YouTube last night, and I've also put up all of the videos for the Leopard in the Golden Cage, and I've also tried to make them a bit easier to find, which is, I don't know, I'm not convinced it's working. I've put lots and lots of tags on them. You do seem, if you type in, for example, if you type in the Scar Gatherer, well, I've now just changed the name of the channel to Scar Gatherer Series. It was the Scar Gatherer. If you typed in the Scar Gatherer, you'd get the channel straight away and all the videos. If you just typed in Scar Gatherer without the word the, it couldn't find it. Not very sophisticated search system in YouTube, it would seem. Anyway, it's all there. I might put a link on this video, on the text of this video, to it in case any of you want to watch it there rather than on Facebook. Although, to be honest, by the time you've got to Facebook, then, you know, you found me. So I'm not sure why you'd go and watch the same thing somewhere else. But I know Facebook's a bit funny about accounts sometimes and won't let you, it doesn't like to let you browse if you don't have an account. And clearly some of you might not want to have an account, and I could quite understand that. So here we are, here we go again. We're a long way into this Viking story. I was thinking yesterday, one of the things that I tell children about when I go into schools, I ask them if they know what very common day-to-day technology is named after a Viking. In fact, I've got some little signs that I could show you. You know what? See if you can find out what very common day-to-day technology is named after a Viking between now and tomorrow. I will try and remember to get my signs out that I show when I stand up in front of big groups of kids to talk about Vikings and the rest of the series. I do a sort of whistle-stop tour through history, which doesn't half cram a lot in. And I hold up these signs to help them to try to guess what the thing is. They come up with all sorts: telephones, computers, pens and pencils, all sorts, from really not really very technical technology like pencils through to computers and tablets and things. But just now and then I go into a school and somebody either already knows or guesses correctly, but it's really rare. So anyway, see whether you can work out by tomorrow what this technology is that's named after a famous Viking, and I will try and bring the symbols tomorrow to show you before I start reading, so that you can work it out if you hadn't already guessed. All right, here we are again. I'm snuggled up. I was thinking some of you might be wondering where the hell I am. I'm snuggled up on a very small sofa upstairs in a sort of attic room. I've got a skylight above me, which is why I seem to have light shining down on my head. It's not because I'm an angel. It's probably not the warmest place in the house, but it is quite comfy, and it is very quiet relatively, unless somebody goes and starts playing the piano noisily downstairs, because that's immediately underneath me. Hopefully that won't happen. I've managed to put a stop to it the only time it did, and my boys are doing Lego in a different room completely currently, so that should be fine. So we're on chapter 13. They're on their way to the ship burial. I loved writing this. I have to say, I absolutely loved doing the research. I was amused when I was doing the research to realise that there really genuinely must have been such a thing as a Viking traffic jam, because trying to get out through the one gate in the city wall that leads out in the right direction, which if everybody's trying to go the same way, would be exactly like trying to get out of a car park after a big event, which is what Joe thinks. So traffic jams are really not a modern invention at all. But they're on their way, they're on the road out towards this place where the river narrows, just before the river narrows. So the ship will have come up from the sea, will have come upriver from the sea, and then the Viking ship burial is going to be held just before the river narrows. All right, chapter 13. It seemed to take forever to get to Howden. Joe thought he remembered seeing it on the map, closer to York than Staddlethorpe Broad Lane, which itself had only been about 25 miles away. But the horse didn't go that much quicker than they could have walked, and they had to stop several times to dig the cartwheels out of the mud. By the time they arrived, it was mid-afternoon. Joe stirred himself and looked around. They were in the middle of an enormous field with a river running along the bottom of it. There was nothing else here, no village or building of any kind, only an encampment of tents which was growing larger as more and more people arrived. He climbed down, stretching and yawning, surprised at how tired he was from the journey. He was also stiff with cold. What would be really nice now, he thought, would be a long hot bath, or at least a mug of hot chocolate in front of a fire to help him warm up. Instead, there was grass and frozen mud and no shelter from the open skies or the wind that whipped across the field. Aileen stamped her feet and blew on her hands. "Right, Anya and Pedder, I want you to get buckets down from the cart and fetch water from the river. Louishak and Joe, go and ask someone for some embers. Those families over there have been here longest." She pointed. "Take this pot and make sure they don't go out on the way back. Sorka, please can you lay the fire with the wood we brought so it's ready to light as soon as they come back. Matthias and I will help your father get the shelter up." Joe set off with Lucy towards the end of the field Aileen had indicated. "How does she know those people have been here longest?" he asked, yawning again. "Lots of other families have got their tents up." He gestured around at the groups of people dotted around the field, unloading their possessions from their carts. In between the finished camps, the latest arrivals were busy constructing A-frame tents, with the pair of diagonals at each end joined by a ridgepole, all held together by a rectangular structure around the bottom. Once the frames were ready, they tied sheets of thick, cream-coloured material onto them and pegged them to the frozen ground. Lucy looked around. "I suppose if you'd arrived first," she said, "you'd choose the best spot to set up your shelter. And that's all the way over there, is it?" She grinned. "Well, they've got the only place that's not windy, in the lee of the hedgerow. So yes, it is." "Oh, I see. But that still doesn't explain why their fire is better than anyone else's." "Yes, it does. The longer the fire's been lit, the hotter it's likely to be, and the easiest way to light a fire is to use embers or burning charcoal from another fire that's really hot." "You don't use matches, then?" Lucy looked blank. "Matches? Never mind." She paused to speak to someone she knew. Joe waited. As they walked on, she waved to another family. "Isn't it exciting?" she said, her face glowing. "I've never been to anything like this before." "Me neither," Joe said. "I've seen big camps a bit like this, but not quite the same. Do you know a lot of these people?" "About half of them, I think. Seems funny to travel such a long way and then see so many people from home." They came to a tent with a roaring fire outside. There was a big black pot hung over it, just like at Lucy's house. Joe hung back while she approached. A few moments later she came out with a man Joe recognised as the host from the storytelling evening. He guffawed loudly at something Lucy had said, then picked up a large pair of tongs and plucked 2 red-hot pieces of charcoal from the fire. "Ready, young lady?" He dropped them into the pot Lucy held out. "No stopping to gossip on your way back now." He grinned and went back inside his tent. Joe and Lucy hurried back across the field together. Joe was amazed to see that the tent was up already. For some reason he'd expected it to take much longer than a modern tent. It was also surprisingly large. Inside, Aileen was spreading furs over a ground sheet at one end, and there were 2 trestles in the middle, balancing a short piece of wood which acted as a makeshift table. Sorka took the charcoal from Lucy and bent down to the fire she had laid in front of the tent, sheltering it from the wind with one hand while she coaxed the kindling to light. Lockie and Matthias carried on lifting down the rest of the luggage from the cart. From all around the field, despite the wind, Joe could hear a hum of excitement. "There'll be just time to finish setting up before we have to wash and change," Lockie said, as he and Matthias carried the chest of clothes into the tent. "What time does it begin?" Lucy asked. "Dusk." "Where do we wash?" asked Joe. "In the river." Joe shuddered. He was still quite cold, and bathing in icy water sounded like a terrible idea. He wondered what would happen if he got ill here. It would be hard to explain back at home how he'd caught pneumonia sitting in the classroom. For the next little while, Lockie and Aileen kept everyone busy with jobs. Extra lengths of fabric were hung over the walls on the inside of the tent to make it warmer, and all of the family's possessions were stowed away as neatly as possible, just like setting up camp on Joe's own family holidays. The cooking pot was hung over the fire outside, on the stand they had brought from home, and once the fire was hot, 2 large pots of tallow were nestled into the flames at the edge. Lockie brought out a dozen long sticks, which had already been wound round at one end with rope. As soon as the tallow had melted, he set Joe and Pedder to dipping the roped ends in the hot liquid. Joe gazed into the flames, glad to be given a job that allowed him to stand where it was warm. When at last he went with Lockie to wash in the river, he was relieved to find that he was only expected to splash his face, hands and arms, though Lockie and Matthias immersed their whole heads to rinse their hair. Back at the tent, Aileen and the girls had bathed and dressed already, and were busy fastening their best brooches and putting on makeup. Joe changed quickly into the same set of clothes he'd worn for the storytelling evening, and sat down in a corner to wait. Presently there was a faint beating sound in the distance. Everyone around him looked up, listening. "The ship has arrived," Aileen murmured. "It's time to go," Lockie said. He handed Matthias his new helmet, put on his own, and picked up the bundle of dipped sticks. Keeping one for himself, he gave one each to Aileen and Matthias, and put the rest in a bag slung over his shoulder beneath his cloak. "Have you got the dish?" Aileen asked. Lockie nodded. He thrust the end of his stick into the fire. There was a spitting sound and a flare of brightness as the tallowed rope caught light. He lifted it, burning, into the air. Aileen and Matthias did the same. All around the field in the half-light, flames were springing up. Then from every part of the encampment the flickering light began to move towards the river and the sound of the drums. Lucy's family fell into line, with Lockie and Matthias at the head, followed by Sorka and Pedder. Aileen came next, holding Anya's hand, while Joe and Lucy walked quietly side by side at the back. Joe tried hard to notice and remember every detail: the bobbing flames, the muted sound of so many people moving in near silence together, the bite of sharp cold in the air, the cry of seabirds above them drifting inland for the night, and behind it always the insistent beat of the drums. Soon he could see a warm glow ahead. On the bank of the river were 2 enormous bonfires. Moored between them, with its prow to the shore, was a Viking longship, its proud carved head reared up at the front, and from the centre its graceful mast reached high into the violet sky. Firelight glinted on the circles of the shields set out along the side of the boat, and beneath them its curved hull bristled with oars. Joe felt his heart skip a beat. The ship was more beautiful and more impressive than he could ever have imagined. As the torchlight procession reached the nearer of the 2 bonfires, the people at the front began to form a straight line that led inland away from the bank of the river. People coming from the opposite direction did the same. The torches were making a corridor of light, Joe realised. He took place beside Lucy, and a tingle of excitement shivered through him. On the ground between the two lines lay the felled trunks of what Joe guessed must be 100 tall, straight trees, arranged crossways like the steps of a ladder. After a few minutes, the drums stopped. In silence, the men handed their torches and shields to their wives and children and stepped forward. As one, they moved down towards the river, past the ends of the tree trunks. When they reached the bank, they didn't stop, but stepped out into the freezing black water to surround the ship. Joe glanced at his friend. She stood with her mouth open, entranced. The oars were drawn in, and each man took up a rope from beside the hull and put it over his shoulder. Then the drums began again, marking out a slow, steady rhythm this time. It was clearly a signal, because with every fourth beat there came a sound that was something between a growl and a roar as the men strained together against the ship's colossal weight. Inch by inch they hauled the mighty vessel forward, out of the water and up the shore, the trunks of the trees rolling beneath its hull as it moved. Joe watched Lockie and Matthias pass him, the arteries in their faces standing out like ropes as they heaved and sweated. At last the prow of the ship reached the darkness at the top of the line, and the drumming changed rhythm once more. Joe leaned forward to try to see what was happening. The ship began to tip very slightly, and then a little more, as the men at the front lowered the bow into a shallow pit that had been dug out of the ground. The drums stopped, and there were shouts that Joe couldn't understand. Then, even more slowly than before, the men dragged the ship forward and down into the pit. Behind them, the older boys carried away the last of the tree trunks. A group of women encircled an immense pile of wood beyond the prow and drove their torches into the heart of it, setting it alight. From the river's edge, the two sides of the blazing corridor came together as people moved in a mass towards the ship. Joe and Lucy edged forward with everyone else. The mast was lowered, and the sound of drumming grew louder. A whisper rippled through the crowd. Joe looked around to see what was happening. From some distance away, on the hillside above them, a bright knot of light had emerged from the darkness, followed by a line of torches like a string of fairy lights. "It's him," Lucy whispered. "It's the king." As the light approached the edge of the crowd, Joe could just make out 6 men carrying a kind of stretcher on their shoulders. It had upright poles at each corner, which supported a canopy over the body, like the drapes on a 4-poster bed. Despite the light cast by the torch-bearers who flanked the stretcher, it was too dark to see much of the great man himself. Behind, a young woman stumbled along, weeping loudly and bound at the wrist to a man. They, in turn, were followed by a line of men and women leading horses, bullocks, and dogs towards the ship. The crowd parted, and the stretcher-bearers boarded the boat and lifted the body of the king onto a kind of bed. About half the men who had dragged the vessel up from the river then stepped forward, Lockie among them. Light shone on the silver dish he brought out from the bag beneath his cloak. He leaned over the side of the ship and placed it beside the dead king. The other men, too, made their offerings. As Lockie moved away, Joe watched the weeping woman step onto the boat. The bonds at her wrist were cut, and she knelt beside the king's body, wailing. Behind her, the animals were also led up the gangplank onto the ship. Joe tugged Aileen's sleeve. "What happens to all of them?" he whispered. Lucy's mother looked down at him. "They go with King Sigtrygr into the afterlife," she murmured. "Woman, his wife?" "No, she's his favourite female slave." So what does she do? How can she go with him? Before Aileen could answer, Joe suddenly knew what she was going to say. He felt the hairs stand up on the back of his neck. She'll be sacrificed, Aileen whispered, along with the animals. Joe shivered. They kill her. Aileen nodded. But that's horrible. Tears had sprung in Lucy's eyes. Hush. Aileen put her hand gently on her daughter's head. In spite of the glow from the torches all around, she herself looked pale. That's the custom, she whispered. She reached out and pulled Joe and Lucy close to her skirts. Will she be buried alive? Lucy asked between sobs. No. An old woman will come. They call her the Angel of Death. She'll kill the girl quickly and cleanly so that she doesn't suffer. But she's suffering already, Joe protested. She knows what's going to happen. That's why she's crying, isn't it? She's not sad about the king. She's terrified. Aileen squeezed his shoulder. She volunteered, she said gently. She may be afraid now, but she asked to be chosen for this. It's a great honour. The crowd stirred again as the drummers moved forward. They boarded the ship and formed a line down both sides, shoulder to shoulder with the other men already on the boat. The king, the young woman, and all the animals were hidden from view. An old woman shuffled forward, bent over her walking stick. That's her, isn't it? The Angel of Death. Lucy buried her face in Aileen's side. I can't watch. The old woman made her way slowly up the gangplank. For the briefest moment, Joe thought he heard the weeping of the young woman change to a scream. Then the drumming rose to a deafening level, drowning out her cries. He closed his eyes and wished passionately that he was back in the classroom at home. So Joe's got a little bit more than perhaps he bargained for. He wasn't expecting to witness something like that. And it is true, it did happen. Quite unpleasant, really. But nonetheless, Aileen is right that the young woman volunteered. She put herself forward for it. She was his favourite slave, but after he died, he wasn't going to say who it was. She volunteered. She volunteered to die with him. So there we are. Different cultures have different customs. Anyway, that's it for today. I will see you tomorrow, 5 o'clock, for chapter 14. So we've got 3 chapters left, 14, 15, 16. Yeah, so we're really close to the end now. I hope you've been enjoying it. I'm finding I'm really enjoying reading these, and it's really good to have the number of videos sort of growing gradually day by day. It's nice to do something positive when we're all stuck indoors still. So yeah, we're up to, I think there are 28 videos up currently, and this will be the 29th. I'll put this one up in a minute and I'll put it onto YouTube too. So I'll see you all tomorrow, 5 o'clock, for chapter 14. Bye, have a good evening.